The morning of March 6, 1944, 23,000 feet above Germany, Staff Sergeant Robert Haley gripped the twin handles of his .50 caliber Browning machine guns, his breath forming ice crystals inside the cramped ball turret suspended beneath the belly of a B-17 flying fortress named Lucky Lady. Through the plexiglass sphere that surrounded him, Haley could see the entire nightmare unfolding in 3 dimensions. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 40 Messerschmitt 109s were diving through the bomber formation from 11 o'clock high, yellow-nosed predators streaking toward the lead squadron at over 400 miles per hour. His squadron commander's voice crackled through the intercom. "All gunners, weapons free, track your targets, but watch your fire zones." Haley knew what that meant. For 2 years, American bomber crews had been trained to never fire when another friendly aircraft crossed their line of sight. The rules were absolute. You waited. You let the German fighter pass through that brief window where a sister ship blocked your shot. You accepted those lost seconds, those wasted opportunities, because hitting a fellow American bomber was unthinkable. But on this morning, 300 miles deep into the Third Reich, above a city the Luftwaffe would defend with everything they had, those rules were about to change. The Germans had learned to exploit the gaps. They had discovered that American gunners hesitated, that they would hold their fire rather than risk fratricide. And they were using that knowledge to kill American bombers with devastating efficiency. What Haley didn't know was that by the time the sun set on March 6th, the Luftwaffe would lose 160 aircraft over Berlin in a single day. That P-51 Mustang pilots and B-17 gunners, working in a desperate coordination neither side had planned, would achieve the highest single-day aerial victory count of the European air war, and that the tactics forcing him to consider the unthinkable, firing through his own formation, would fundamentally alter how America fought the air war over Germany. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The path to March 6th began not over Berlin, but over Schweinfurt, Germany, on October 14, 1943. Captain James Morrison commanded a B-17 from the 91st Bomb Group that morning, leading his crew on what intelligence promised would be a precision strike against Germany's ball-bearing production facilities. The target was critical. 52% of Germany's ball bearings came from Schweinfurt. Destroy those factories, military planners argued, and you cripple the entire German war machine within 2 months. Morrison's aircraft carried a crew of 10 men, each trained for months in their specialized roles. The reality of that training, however, crashed into the brutal mathematics of aerial combat the moment American P-47 Thunderbolts reached the limit of their range and turned back toward England. The bombers continued east, alone, penetrating deeper into German airspace than any previous daylight mission. German radar detected the formation while it was still over Belgium. Luftwaffe controllers scrambled every available fighter within 200 miles. By the time Morrison's group reached Schweinfurt, over 300 German fighters were airborne, positioned in layers from 15,000 to 30,000 feet, waiting to execute coordinated attacks that American defensive tactics had never encountered. The assault began with head-on attacks, Messerschmitt 109s diving from directly ahead at closing speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour. Morrison's bombardier, Lieutenant Thomas Chen, watched through the plexiglass nose as a German fighter grew from a distant speck to a weapon-bristling predator in less than 5 seconds. Chen fired his twin .50 calibers, tracers arcing out toward the approaching fighter. The Germans' cannon shells walked up the B-17's nose, shattering the bombardier's compartment, killing Chen instantly, and continuing through the cockpit where they wounded Morrison and destroyed half his flight controls. Morrison fought to maintain formation as his aircraft began losing altitude. Formation integrity meant survival. A bomber that fell behind became an isolated target that German fighters would swarm and destroy. The combat box formation, developed by Colonel Curtis LeMay, was designed to create interlocking fields of defensive fire, each aircraft protecting its neighbors, presenting attacking fighters with a wall of 50 caliber machine gun fire from hundreds of weapons. But Morrison's gunners faced an impossible problem. Sergeant William Davidson, occupying the top turret, acquired a Focke-Wulf 190 attacking from 4 o'clock high. He tracked the target, leading it properly, his fingers tightening on the triggers. Then another B-17 crossed into his line of fire, blocking his shot for 3 critical seconds. By the time his field cleared, the German fighter had already fired its cannon burst and was pulling away. Davidson watched the shells impact a bomber 200 yards to his left. The right wing erupted in flames. This scenario repeated itself across the entire formation. American gunners, trained to prioritize avoiding friendly fire incidents, held their triggers when other bombers entered their firing solutions. German pilots, through months of combat experience, had learned to time their attacks to exploit these gaps. They approached along vectors that forced American gunners to choose between holding fire or risking hitting friendly aircraft. More often than not, the Americans chose to wait. Those seconds of hesitation proved fatal. The Schweinfurt raid lost 60 B-17 bombers, 360 men killed or captured, another 17 aircraft so badly damaged they never flew again. The loss rate approached 25% of the attacking force. These numbers were unsustainable. At this attrition rate, 8th Air Force would lose its entire bomber strength within months. General Henry Arnold, commanding general of United States Army Air Forces, ordered a fundamental reassessment of daylight bombing doctrine. Staff officers analyzed combat film footage from hundreds of missions. They interviewed surviving crew members. They studied wreckage patterns. The conclusions challenged assumptions that had guided American air power strategy since before the war began. The theory of mutual defensive fire assumed that bombers in tight formation could protect each other through sheer volume of fire. American planners calculated that a combat box of 54 bombers carried over 650 defensive machine guns. No fighter, they reasoned, could penetrate that fire without being destroyed. But the Luftwaffe wasn't trying to penetrate. They were exploiting the moments when American gunners couldn't fire. German fighter tactics evolved specifically to create situations where defensive fire became impossible. They attacked through the vertical gaps between squadron elements. They timed their approaches to coincide with moments when multiple bombers masked each other. They forced American gunners into split-second decisions where every option carried risk. Major Thomas Ferguson, an intelligence officer with 8th Bomber Command, presented his analysis to senior leadership in November 1943. His report included a disturbing statistic. Film analysis revealed that American gunners held fire during approximately 40% of potential firing opportunities, specifically due to friendly aircraft blocking their line of sight. German fighters were achieving successful attacks during those same windows, at rates exceeding 70%. The implications were clear. American defensive tactics, designed to prevent fratricide, were ensuring bomber losses instead. The combat box formation created the very gaps that German fighters exploited. Tighter formation flying increased the frequency of blocking incidents. Looser formations reduced defensive fire concentration and made bombers more vulnerable to flak. Either way, men died. Ferguson's recommendation shocked the assembled officers. He proposed training bomber gunners to fire through their own formations under specific conditions, not indiscriminately, not without consideration for the risks. But when a confirmed German fighter attack was in progress, when waiting meant certain destruction of the bomber being attacked, American gunners should fire regardless of whether another American aircraft was in the background of their sight. Picture. The proposal met immediate resistance. Colonel David Williams, operations officer for the 8th Air Force, stood from his seat and delivered a response that reflected the institutional horror at Ferguson's suggestion. We cannot ask American gunners to shoot at American aircraft. The psychological burden alone would destroy morale. One incident of a B-17 shooting down another B-17 would shatter crew confidence across the entire force. Williams raised valid concerns. Friendly fire incidents already occurred, despite all precautions. Combat damage reports from late 1943 documented dozens of bombers hit by 50 caliber rounds from unknown sources. Some incidents resulted from confused gunners firing at friendly fighters mistaken for German aircraft. Others came from panicked gunners spraying fire wildly during attacks. Each incident eroded trust between crews, but Ferguson countered with mathematics that couldn't be ignored. "We're losing bombers at a rate of 5 to 8% per mission over German targets. Experienced crews complete 25 missions before rotation. The probability that an individual crew member survives a full tour is less than 30%. These men are dying because they're following our orders to not fire when friendly aircraft are nearby. Meanwhile, German fighters are killing them during exactly those moments." The debate continued for weeks. Bomber crews themselves remained divided. Some pilots supported any tactic that might reduce losses. Others refused to consider firing solutions that put fellow Americans at risk. Gunners expressed particular reluctance. The men who would actually pull the triggers understood viscerally what headquarters staff could only theorize about. Sergeant Michael O'Brien, a waist gunner with the 306th Bomb Group, spoke to reporters from Stars and Stripes newspaper about the controversy in December 1943. "They want us to shoot when there's a fort, in the background. But I can see those guys. I know those crews. Yesterday, I ate breakfast with the tail gunner from the ship that flies off our right wing. Now they're telling me to fire a burst that might hit his aircraft? That ain't soldiering. That's murder." O'Brien's concerns reflected the human reality of modern warfare. These weren't anonymous enemies engaged at sterile distances. Every man in the bomber stream knew someone in every other aircraft within their squadron. They shared barracks, they played cards together, they wrote letters home on the same tables in the same recreation halls. The social bonds made the prospect of fratricide psychologically devastating, yet the alternative was equally devastating. On November 26, 1943, during a mission to Bremen, Germany, Lieutenant Richard Patterson's B-17 took hits from a German fighter that approached from 6 o'clock level, directly behind the bomber formation. Patterson's tail gunner, Sergeant James Miller, had a perfect shot. He tracked the Messerschmitt 109 precisely, his training taking over even amid the chaos of combat. His finger pressed against the trigger, then another B-17, its pilot struggling to maintain position after taking flak damage, drifted down into Miller's line of fire. The other bomber completely obscured the German fighter for 2 seconds. Miller released the trigger and waited. The German pilot used those 2 seconds to close from 800 yards to 400 yards, achieving an optimal firing position. His cannon shells hit Patterson's aircraft in the wing, root and fuselage. Both inboard engines caught fire. The bomber began losing altitude immediately. Patterson rang the bailout bell. 8 crewmen escaped. 2 died when they couldn't reach their parachutes before the aircraft entered its final dive. Miller survived. He made it to a German prisoner of war camp, where he would spend the next 18 months. In interviews conducted after the war, he described the incident with precision that suggested he had replayed the moment thousands of times. "I had him cold. I knew exactly where to aim, but I couldn't shoot through our own ship. I just couldn't do it. So I waited, and then Rick Patterson and his crew paid the price for me following the rules." Stories like Miller's accumulated through late 1943 and early 1944. Each incident added weight to Ferguson's argument. Each loss demonstrated the fatal flaw in American defensive doctrine. The question was no longer whether tactics needed to change, but whether the psychological and operational costs of changing them exceeded the costs of continuing current practices. The answer arrived through unexpected channels. British RAF Bomber Command, which flew night missions over Germany and thus faced different tactical challenges, had nonetheless conducted extensive research into defensive gunnery effectiveness. Air Marshal Arthur Harris shared British findings with his American counterparts in January 1944. The British data revealed that strict fire discipline rules reduced overall defensive effectiveness by approximately 35% compared to theoretical maximum firepower. Moreover, analysis of friendly fire incidents showed that most occurred not when gunners fired through formations, but when panicked or poorly trained gunners fired wildly at non-existent threats or mistakenly identified friendly aircraft as hostile. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The British conclusion suggested that controlled, deliberate firing through formations under specific conditions actually carried lower risk of fratricide than the current American practice of holding fire. The reasoning came down to geometry and probability. A well-aimed burst at a confirmed German fighter, even if another bomber was in the background, placed rounds in a narrow cone of fire directed at a specific target. The bullets would only hit the background bomber if the German fighter and friendly bomber occupied the exact same three-dimensional space at the moment of firing, which was geometrically unlikely. Conversely, panicked fire from a gunner who had been forced to wait, who had watched German fighters approach without being able to respond, who finally got a clear shot and released all his tension in an extended burst, tended to spray rounds across a much wider area with much lower precision. That pattern created significantly higher fratricide risk. Armed with British data and mounting evidence from their own operations, 8th Air Force leadership reached a decision in February 1944. They would implement limited authorization for firing through formations, but with strict conditions. Gunners could fire when all of the following criteria were met: positive identification of an attacking German fighter, imminent threat to a bomber in the formation, no other firing solution available, and controlled short bursts aimed precisely at the confirmed target. The new rules would be taught through intensive training conducted by experienced combat gunners who would demonstrate proper technique. The training emphasized fire discipline, precise aim, and constant awareness of friendly aircraft positions. Gunners would learn to calculate deflection angles that accounted for both target movement and friendly aircraft positions. They would practice recognition of situations where firing through formations was appropriate versus situations where holding fire remained the correct choice. Implementation began in late February 1944. Gunnery instructors visited operational bomber groups across England, conducting classroom sessions and practical exercises. The response from crews was mixed. Some embraced the new tactics as long overdue recognition of combat realities. Others remained deeply uncomfortable with rules that seemed to violate fundamental principles of military discipline. Staff Sergeant Robert Haley attended the training session for his squadron in early March. The instructor, Master Sergeant Carl Anderson, had completed 53 combat missions and survived being shot down twice. His credibility with the assembled gunners was absolute. Anderson described the new doctrine in terms that acknowledged their concerns while explaining the necessity. "I know what you're thinking. You're thinking we're asking you to risk killing your friends. But here's the reality. The Germans are killing your friends right now, during those seconds you're holding fire. What we're teaching you is how to stop them while minimizing risk to other crews. This isn't about being careless. This is about being more careful in a different way." Anderson showed combat footage that illustrated the technique. The film depicted a tail gunner engaging a Focke-Wulf 190 attacking from 6 o'clock. Another B-17 was visible in the background, roughly 1,000 yards behind the target fighter. The gunner fired a 3-second burst. Tracers showed the rounds converging on the German fighter, which exploded. The bomber in the background flew through the engagement completely unaffected. The bullets, traveling at roughly 2,800 feet per second, had either hit their intended target or continued past it, spreading across an area measured in miles by the time they reached the altitude where the background bomber flew. "Look at the geometry," Anderson explained. "The German fighter is at 400 yards. The friendly bomber is at 1,000 yards. That's 600 yards of separation. A well-aimed burst at the fighter isn't going to hit the bomber behind it unless your aim is so bad you miss by 600 yards. And if your aim is that bad, you shouldn't be shooting anyway." The training continued through the first week of March. By March 4th, when 8th Air Force launched its first major daylight raid on Berlin, most bomber gunners had received at least basic instruction in the new tactics. They understood the principles. Whether they could execute under the stress of actual combat remained to be tested. March 4th produced mixed results. Weather prevented most bombers from reaching their primary targets. The few groups that found openings in the cloud cover encountered moderate German fighter resistance. Gunner performance varied widely. Some crews reverted to old habits, holding fire when friendly aircraft appeared in their sight picture. Others applied the new doctrine successfully, engaging targets that previously would have gone unmolested. The real test came 2 days later, on March 6th, when 660 B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds took off from airfields across England, bound for targets in Berlin. The weather forecast predicted clear skies over the German capital. Intelligence estimated that the Luftwaffe would commit every available fighter to defend Berlin. The mission would be the largest daylight attack on the Nazi capital to date, and it would prove whether American bomber crews could implement their new defensive tactics in the cauldron of the war's most intense aerial combat. The formation assembly began at 0700 hours on March 6th. Across dozens of airfields in eastern England, ground crews pulled engine covers from B-17 seconds that had been pre-flighted in the pre-dawn darkness. Pilots conducted final walkarounds, checking control surfaces and inspecting the bomb loads secured in internal bays. 660 heavy bombers would participate in the mission, the largest American daylight assault on Berlin attempted to date. Staff Sergeant Robert Haley climbed into the ball turret of Lucky Lady at 07:45. The cramped sphere offered no room for parachute or bulky flight gear. Haley wore only his heated suit, against the -40-degree temperatures at altitude, accepting the vulnerability that came with the position. Ball turret gunners had the clearest view of any crew position, able to rotate their turret 360 degrees and track targets through the transparent plexiglass. They also had the lowest survival rate when aircraft went down. The turret's emergency exit required precious seconds to operate, time that men rarely had when their bomber was falling out of control. The takeoff sequence proceeded with practiced precision. Lead aircraft lifted off first, followed at 30-second intervals by the rest of the formation. Each group climbed to its assigned altitude and circled a designated radio beacon, a system called buncher or splasher, waiting for all aircraft to join up. The assembly process took 90 minutes. By 09:30, the entire bomber stream stretched across 70 miles of sky, 660 aircraft arranged in combat boxes that stacked squadrons at different altitudes to maximize defensive fire coverage. The route to Berlin took the formation northeast across the North Sea, over the Netherlands, and directly into German airspace. Fighter escorts joined at predetermined points. P-47 Thunderbolts provided coverage during the initial penetration. P-38 Lightnings took over for the middle segment. And crucially, for the first time in the European Air War, P-51 Mustangs would escort the bombers all the way to Berlin and back, their extended range finally solving the problem that had plagued American air operations since 1942. Lieutenant Colonel Donald Blakesley led 48 P-51 seconds from the 4th Fighter Group into the target area. His pilots had been flying Mustangs for less than 2 weeks. Some had fewer than 10 hours in the aircraft, but the P-51's performance characteristics made it the weapon 8th Air Force needed. With 2 external drop tanks, the Mustang could fly 850 miles from England, fight for 20 minutes over Berlin, and return home. The Germans had declared this impossible. Their intelligence calculations showed that no American single-engine fighter possessed such range. They were about to discover how wrong those calculations had been. The first German fighters appeared at 1100 hours, 50 miles west of Berlin. Luftwaffe controllers had scrambled every available aircraft within 200 miles of the capital. Major Hans Kogler led 7 Messerschmitt 110 twin-engine fighters, followed by a larger formation of 41 Messerschmitt 410s and 72 Messerschmitt 109s. The German force totaled over 120 fighters, positioned to intercept the American bombers before they reached their targets. Blakesley spotted the German formation at 11:05. His radio call alerted all P-51 groups in the area. Bandits, 2 o'clock high, large formation, all Mustang flights engage. The American fighters broke from their escort positions and turned to intercept. The resulting air battle spread across 100 square miles of sky, a 3-dimensional chess match played at speeds approaching 500 miles per hour. The engagement revealed immediately how dramatically the tactical situation had shifted. German pilots had grown accustomed to attacking American bomber formations with minimal fighter interference. They planned their approaches based on the knowledge that American escorts would be low on fuel, reluctant to pursue too aggressively for fear of leaving bombers unprotected, and limited in their ability to operate far from their bases. The P-51 seconds invalidated every one of those assumptions. Captain Don Gentile, flying with Blakesley's group, engaged a Messerschmitt 109 that was diving toward the lead bomber box. Gentile's Mustang closed the distance in seconds, the superior speed and maneuverability of the American fighter negating the German pilot's tactical advantages. Gentile fired a 2-second burst from 400 yards. His 50 caliber rounds walked up the Messerschmitt's fuselage, hitting the engine and cockpit. The German fighter rolled inverted and fell away, trailing smoke. Similar engagements erupted across the battle space. P-51 pilots discovered that they could not only escort bombers to Berlin, but could dominate German fighters in the combat that ensued. The Mustang turned with the Messerschmitt 109. It dove with the Focke-Wulf 190. It could maintain combat speed at altitudes where German engines struggled for power. Most critically, it could stay in the fight. German fighters that broke off attacks to escape found American fighters pursuing them back toward their own airfields, a reversal of roles that shocked Luftwaffe pilots who had never experienced sustained pressure so deep inside Germany. But not all German fighters were intercepted. Major Günther Roll, an experienced Luftwaffe pilot with over 200 kills on the Eastern Front, led a group of Messerschmitt 109s that slipped past the fighter screen by using cloud cover. Roll's formation positioned itself at 28,000 feet, 4,000 feet above the bomber stream, approaching from the sun to minimize detection time. Staff Sergeant Robert Haley, rotating his ball turret to scan the sky below Lucky Lady, never saw Roll's fighters until they were already committed to their attack run. The German formation dove in a line-astern approach, each fighter offset slightly from the one ahead, creating a gauntlet that the bombers would have to fly through. The tactics were textbook Luftwaffe doctrine, refined through 3 years of combat against American heavy bombers. Haley acquired the lead Messerschmitt at 700 yards, diving at 60 degrees, closing at over 400 miles per hour. His training took over. Track the target, calculate deflection, lead the fighter by the proper angle to account for its speed and direction. His fingers tightened on the triggers. Then he saw the problem. Another B-17, flying in the high squadron 200 yards above Lucky Lady, was directly behind the diving Messerschmitt in Haley's line of sight. 3 weeks earlier, Haley would have released the triggers and waited for the geometry to change. The training from late February echoed in his mind. Master Sergeant Anderson's voice. The combat footage, the mathematics of firing solutions. Haley kept his sight picture centered on the diving fighter and pressed the triggers. The twin 50 calibers roared, recoil shaking the entire turret. Tracers arced upward, converging on the Messerschmitt. Haley fired a 3-second burst, 20 rounds per gun, 60 rounds total. He watched his bullets strike the German fighter's wing root and engine cowling. Pieces of aluminum skin tore away. The Messerschmitt's dive angle steepened uncontrollably as the pilot lost elevator authority. The fighter plunged, past the bomber formation, and disappeared toward the ground 12,000 feet below. The B-17 that had been in the background of Haley's sight picture continued flying in perfect formation, untouched. The geometry that Anderson had explained proved accurate. Haley's bullets, aimed at a target 400 yards away, had either hit that target or continued past it, spreading across an area measured in hundreds of yards by the time they reached the altitude where the background bomber flew. But Haley's engagement was only one small piece of a massive air battle that was reaching its climax over Berlin. Across the entire bomber stream, American gunners were implementing the new firing doctrine, some successfully, some with tragic results that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Sergeant Thomas Davidson, manning the top turret on a B-17 named Silver Dollar, engaged a Focke-Wulf 190 attacking from 3 o'clock high. Davidson tracked the target smoothly, his turret rotation matching the fighter's crossing angle. He fired when the German was at 500 yards. His burst was perfectly aimed. 10 of his rounds hit the Focke-Wulf's engine, causing catastrophic failure that forced the pilot to bail out. But 3 of Davidson's rounds missed high. Those 3 bullets continued traveling at ballistic velocity, arcing through the sky. One struck a B-24 Liberator flying 800 yards beyond the Focke-Wulf, punching through the vertical stabilizer and lodging in the rudder control mechanism. The damage was minor. The B-24 completed its mission and returned to England. But the bullet hole in the stabilizer would remind Davidson for the rest of his life that the new tactics carried real costs alongside their benefits. Not all friendly fire incidents ended so benignly. At 11:23, a waist gunner on a B-17 named Memphis Queen fired at a Messerschmitt 109, attacking from 5 o'clock level. The gunner's aim was poor, his burst, going wide by 30 degrees. Several rounds struck the left wing of another B-17, flying 200 yards to the left. One bullet severed a fuel line. Aviation gasoline began streaming from the damaged wing, creating a vapor trail visible for miles. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The pilot of the damaged bomber, Lieutenant James Mitchell, immediately shut down the fuel pumps to that wing and activated fire suppression systems. The leak stopped, but Mitchell's aircraft now flew with reduced fuel capacity. He calculated quickly. With one wing tank unusable, he had enough fuel to reach Berlin, drop his bombs, and make it approximately 200 miles on the return flight before running dry. He would have to crash land somewhere in occupied Europe or attempt to reach Allied lines that were still hundreds of miles away. Mitchell made his decision in seconds. He would continue the mission. Turning back early would mean his crew accomplished nothing while still facing all the risks of combat flying over German territory. At least if they pressed on, they would put their bombs on target. Mitchell informed his crew of the situation. Every man voted to continue. They would deal with the fuel problem when it became unavoidable. The bombers reached their initial points at 11:35 and began their bomb runs. The IP marked the start of the straight and level flight path that bombardiers required to achieve accurate aim. For the next 12 minutes, the bombers would fly predictably, unable to take evasive action, while German flak batteries filled the sky with exploding steel. The anti-aircraft fire over Berlin exceeded anything the American crews had experienced. 3 massive flak towers, concrete fortresses mounting dozens of 128mm guns, anchored the city's defences. Smaller batteries surrounded every industrial, facility, railroad yard, and government building. The combined firepower put thousands of shells in the air every minute, creating a barrage that seemed impenetrable. Lieutenant Robert Morrison, bombardier on Lucky Lady, watched through his Norden bomb sight as the formation ahead released its bombs. Hundreds of 500-pound weapons tumbled downward, trailing smoke stabilizers. Morrison focused on his target, the Robert Bosch electrical works in the southern suburbs. His finger hovered over the release mechanism. At 11:41, his bomb sight's crosshairs aligned perfectly. He pressed the switch. 24 500-pound bombs fell from Lucky Lady's bomb bay. Across the entire formation, similar releases multiplied the effect. More than 6,000 bombs rained down on Berlin, each weapon carrying enough explosive power to destroy a building or crater a street. The bombs fell for 30 seconds before impacting across the target area. Explosions blossomed across the Pros. Industrial districts, smoke rising to altitudes that would obscure the city for hours. The bomber stream completed its attack and turned west for the long flight home. German fighters continued pressing attacks, but with decreasing effectiveness. The Luftwaffe's losses were mounting catastrophically. P-51 Mustangs, freed from close escort duty by the new doctrine that encouraged them to pursue and destroy German fighters anywhere they could be found, were shooting down German aircraft at unprecedented rates. Major James Goodson, flying with the 4th Fighter Group, destroyed 2 Focke-Wulf 190s in quick succession, using the Mustang's superior speed to run down both targets as they attempted to escape. Captain Charles Gumm engaged a Messerschmitt 109 in a turning fight that lasted 3 minutes and ended when the German pilot, low on fuel and ammunition, attempted to disengage by diving away. Gumm followed him down to 8,000 feet and shot him down over the outskirts of Berlin. The American fighter tactics had evolved alongside the bomber defensive doctrine. Instead of maintaining rigid positions close to the bomber formations, P-51 pilots now ranged ahead and to the sides, intercepting German fighters before they could reach the bombers. When German fighters did break through to attack, American fighters pursued them aggressively, often following them through and past the bomber formations, trusting bomber gunners to recognize friendly aircraft and not fire at the pursuing P-51 seconds. This coordination between bombers and fighters required trust that had been built through months of operations. Bomber gunners learned to identify the distinctive profile of the P-51 Mustang, with its bubble canopy and liquid-cooled engine's streamlined cowling. Fighter pilots learned to approach bomber formations in ways that made their friendly status obvious, avoiding attack angles that might be confused with German tactics. But mistakes still occurred. At 12:05, a P-51 pursuing a damaged Messerschmitt 109 dove through a bomber formation at high speed. A nervous waist gunner, seeing only a fighter diving toward his aircraft, fired a long burst. 3 bullets struck the P-51's wing, causing minor damage. The Mustang pilot, Lieutenant Richard Peterson, felt the impacts and immediately realized what had happened. He broke off pursuit and returned to his escort position, shaken but unhurt. Peterson later commented that he understood the gunner's reaction, noting that split-second decisions in combat rarely allowed for perfect judgment. The flight back to England tested every crew's endurance. The mission had lasted over 6 hours. Men who had been breathing oxygen through masks for the entire flight now faced headaches and fatigue from prolonged high-altitude exposure. Gunners who had maintained vigilant watch for hours felt exhaustion settling into their muscles. Pilots flew formation on instruments and sheer willpower, maintaining position despite bodies that screamed for rest. Lieutenant James Mitchell, piloting the B-17 with the damaged fuel tank, watched his gauges with growing concern. His fuel situation was deteriorating faster than his initial calculations predicted. The leak had apparently not been completely stopped. Vapor continued streaming from the left wing, visible evidence that precious gasoline was bleeding away. By the time the formation crossed back into Allied airspace over the Netherlands, Mitchell knew his aircraft would not make it to England. He made the decision at 1300 hours. "This is Mitchell. I'm declaring emergency. Fuel critical. We're going to put down at the nearest Allied field." His navigator plotted a course to a recently captured airstrip in Belgium, approximately 40 miles south. Mitchell left formation and descended, gambling that he had enough fuel to reach friendly territory. The landing was successful. Mitchell's crew touched down with less than 10 minutes of fuel remaining. They survived because Mitchell made the hard choice to continue the mission despite damage, and because his navigator calculated precisely how far they could fly on limited fuel. The aircraft would be repaired and fly again. The crew would return to England by transport aircraft and continue flying combat missions. But the incident illustrated the costs of the new defensive tactics. The friendly fire that damaged Mitchell's aircraft came directly from implementing the doctrine that authorized firing through formations. Across the entire mission, the results of March 6th told a complex story. The 8th Air Force lost 69 heavy bombers to all causes, a grievous toll representing nearly 690 men killed, wounded, or captured. But the Luftwaffe's losses dwarfed the American casualties. German records documented the loss of 160 aircraft on March 6th, the highest single-day loss the Luftwaffe had sustained in the defense of the Reich. The breakdown of those losses revealed the effectiveness of the combined bomber-fighter tactics. American fighter pilots claimed 82 German aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat. Bomber gunners claimed an additional 78. The numbers exceeded the actual German losses because multiple gunners often claimed the same kill, a persistent problem in aerial combat where observation and verification were nearly impossible. But statistical analysis conducted after the war, comparing American claims against German loss records, suggested that bomber defensive fire accounted for approximately 40 to 50 German aircraft destroyed on March 6th. This represented a dramatic increase in gunner effectiveness compared to previous missions. The new doctrine, allowing gunners to fire through formations under controlled conditions, had demonstrably improved bomber defensive capabilities. The human cost of implementing those tactics appeared in post-mission damage assessments. Examination of returned bombers revealed evidence of friendly fire on approximately 30 aircraft. Most damage was minor, bullet holes in non-critical areas that required only sheet metal patches. 3 aircraft sustained more serious damage, requiring extensive repairs. One B-17 was hit by friendly fire from another bomber in the formation, suffering damage to control surfaces that forced an emergency landing at a coastal airfield. No American bomber was lost directly to friendly fire on March 6, but the psychological weight of the incidents affected crews differently. Some gunners, who knew they had fired bursts that potentially endangered friendly aircraft, reported difficulty sleeping, recurring nightmares of bullets striking the wrong target. Squadron commanders and chaplains worked with affected crew members, providing counseling and reassurance that the new tactics, while carrying risks, were saving more lives than they endangered. Sergeant Robert Haley, reflecting on his engagement with the diving Messerschmitt, struggled with conflicting emotions. He knew his shooting had been accurate, that he had destroyed a German fighter that was attacking his formation, but he also knew that if his aim had been slightly different, if the deflection calculation had been wrong by even a small margin, his bullets might have struck the B-17 inches the background of his sight picture. The responsibility felt crushing at times. Master Sergeant Carl Anderson, the gunnery instructor who had trained Haley and hundreds of other gunners, visited bomber groups across England in the weeks following March 6. His message emphasized the reality of combat decision-making. You're not going to get perfect solutions. You're going to face situations where every choice carries risk. What we've taught you is how to make those risks as small as possible while still accomplishing the mission. The Germans are trying to kill you. Your job is to stop them. Sometimes that means taking calculated risks that would be unacceptable in peacetime. This is war. We do what we must. The strategic implications of March 6 extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, received reports of the day's losses with visible shock. 160 aircraft represented more than 10% of the Luftwaffe's total day fighter strength in Western Europe. The pilots killed or wounded included experienced squadron leaders and flight instructors whose skills could not be easily replaced. More critically, the losses occurred despite every advantage the Luftwaffe possessed: advance warning, numerical superiority at the point of contact, and combat over friendly territory where damaged aircraft could potentially land safely. The appearance of P-51 Mustangs over Berlin, hundreds of miles from England, shattered German assumptions about American fighter capabilities. Luftwaffe intelligence officers had calculated that no single-engine fighter possessed sufficient range to escort bombers to Berlin and return. Those calculations proved catastrophically wrong. The strategic implications were immediately apparent to German commanders. If American fighters could reach Berlin, they could reach any target in Germany. The Luftwaffe would have to defend everywhere simultaneously, dispersing forces that were already insufficient to stop the combined bomber offensive. German fighter tactics evolved rapidly in response to the March 6 losses. Luftwaffe commanders recognized that their previous approaches, developed when American bombers flew without escort deep into Germany, no longer worked. New doctrine emphasized avoiding combat with American fighters when possible, focusing attacks on bombers during brief windows when escorts were engaged elsewhere or when tactical situations created temporary gaps in coverage. But these defensive adaptations came too late to change the fundamental balance of the air war. March 6 marked the point where American air superiority over Germany became inevitable. The Luftwaffe could still inflict casualties, could still shoot down bombers and fighters, could still defend specific targets under favorable conditions. But they could not stop the sustained pressure of hundreds of heavy bombers striking German industry day after day, nor could they prevent the gradual destruction of their own fighter force through attrition they could not sustain. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.